What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a warning. This is the macabre history of the Martin family murders and the child survivor who watched everything. At 7:45 a.m., a quiet street in Moore, Oklahoma, a call came through to emergency services. 3 words whispered in the shaking voice of a child. He heard them. Then silence. No name, no address, just the soft clicking sound of the phone going dead. The line was traced. Officers were dispatched. No one on the team that morning expected to walk into a scene that would ruin their careers, their sleep, and for some, their sanity. Willow Glen Lane was ordinary. American flags on porches, lawns freshly watered. But that morning one house stood out. It wasn't the broken window or the quiet swing creaking in the wind. It was the front door, open just an inch, just enough to know something had slipped through. Inside, nothing was broken, no mess, no screams, just stillness. The smell was the first alarm, metallic, faint, but fresh. In the hallway, officers found a trail of something dark soaked into the carpet. No footprints, just a long drag like something had been pulled. Tina Martin, age 37, was found face down on the floor of the bedroom, dressed for bed, with no signs of a struggle. Maggie Martin, age 9, was under the blanket, still tucked in, still holding her stuffed rabbit. Her skull had been caved in, a single blow, no defensive wounds. In the kitchen, breakfast had been started. 2 plates, 1 untouched, toast in the toaster, juice poured, coffee still warm. But there was no sign of the husband, no sign of the youngest child. Until they went downstairs. The basement door had been locked from the inside. What the first responders saw has never been officially released to the press. But according to leaked reports and the officers who later resigned, Jonathan Martin was found sitting cross-legged on the basement floor, soaked in his wife's blood. His 6-year-old son, Ben, sat beside him, crying but physically unharmed. The man was smiling, not with pride, but with peace. When officers asked what happened, Jonathan said only this: "They weren't clean. Ben is the only one who was." He then raised his wrists to be cuffed as if he'd been waiting. Before we continue with the story and unspeakable secrets, I want to ask you something important. This channel is not for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to confront the darkest chapters of American history. If you made it this far, you're not like most people. You understand some truths are too horrifying to ignore, no matter how much they disturb us. So hit that subscribe button and join our community of true mystery seekers. And tell me in the comments what state you are listening from. Are you brave enough to hear a story like this from your own backyard? The child wouldn't stop shaking. 6-year-old Ben Martin sat wrapped in a police officer's jacket, his bare feet swinging above the cold linoleum of the station floor. Every time the officer offered him water or asked a question, he turned away. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink. The boy had blood on his pajamas, not his own, and not a drop of it on his hands. Back at the house, the scene was being locked down. Forensics began their grim work. The bodies of Tina and Maggie were carefully removed, but the real puzzle, the one that haunted detectives, was the layout of the basement. There were no weapons found, no signs of a fight, just one wooden chair in the center of the floor. And behind it, drawn crudely on the concrete wall in what appeared to be red crayon or blood, was a symbol. A large circle crossed with uneven lines, almost like a child's drawing of the sun. Jonathan Martin had written something beneath it. "Clean hearts will enter, unclean ones must be taken back." It was signed with a single initial, J. Detective Maria Kellerman had been on the force for 19 years. She had handled homicides, domestic violence, cult-related activity, and missing children. But nothing prepared her for the blank, patient expression on Jonathan's face. "Why did you do it?" she asked him softly. He didn't hesitate. "They were being used," he said. "The women, touched by something wrong. I tried to purify them. Only Ben was spared." "Because he's your son?" Jonathan looked up slowly, his eyes dry and unreadable. "Because he listened." That word stuck with Maria. Listened to what? Back in the evidence room, the techs found something unexpected. Dozens of audio tapes labeled by date and kept in a shoebox under Jonathan's bed. Each one was marked with a title: Confession Maggie, Kitchen Interference, Sleeping Hours Wife, Ben's Silence, Prayers. Most of them were damaged, likely erased, but a few could be salvaged. One tape, dated March 18, 1997, began with soft static, then Jonathan's voice. "I hear it again, in the walls, in her breathing. I think it's using them to find me. I can't let it take Ben." Detectives assumed he was suffering from paranoid delusions, but when Ben was later asked about the voice, he only said, "It was in the drain." And this is where the town of Moore, Oklahoma, began to change. Before the murders, no one talked about the Martins. After the murders, no one would even say their name. The neighbors put their houses up for sale. The school painted over the mural in Maggie's class. The bakery Tina used to visit quietly shut down, as if the family had never existed. But one thing did remain: Ben Martin. Alive, silent, and carrying the story no one wanted to hear. It took nearly 10 years for Ben Martin to speak about what happened. In 2006, at age 16, Ben was living in a foster home under a different surname. He had been bounced between care placements for most of his life, described by social workers as withdrawn, compliant, unnaturally quiet. He didn't speak unless prompted. He barely made eye contact. But one night, he drew something on the wall of his room in pencil, the same symbol from the basement. A circle slashed with radiating lines, almost like a primitive sun or eye. When his foster mother asked what it was, Ben just said, "I saw it in the water." That's what my dad was listening to. That's when the case was reflagged. Dr. Helen Stroud was a child trauma specialist in Oklahoma City. She'd worked with victims of abuse, war refugees, and survivors of catastrophic loss. But Ben, even at 16, was like no one she'd met. He didn't cry. He didn't lash out. He spoke slowly, mechanically, as if everything was a memory played back through tape. And the first time he described what happened, he said it like this: "We weren't supposed to go downstairs. But I woke up when I heard Mom scream, so I went to the kitchen. But the lights were off, and the floor was sticky." Dr. Stroud asked gently. Ben nodded, like jam. She didn't correct him. He said his father had been up for days, that he stopped going to work, that he kept reading a Bible that didn't have any words in it. When Ben peeked inside, the pages were all blank, but his father still read aloud. He said something was in the walls, that Mom let it in, that Maggie was marked. Ben told Dr. Stroud that his dad had nailed towels over the vents and sealed the bathroom drains with cement. He said, "It used water to move." Who did? Ben didn't look at her. He whispered, "The one with no eyes." Forensic psychologists dismissed the statement, labeling it as trauma projection, a child's mind inventing monsters to cope with real-life horror. But there were details Ben gave that had never been released to the public: the placement of the bodies, the color of Maggie's nightgown, the location of the missing kitchen knives, which had never been found. He also mentioned something else. His mother had tried to leave 2 nights before it happened, but Jonathan locked all the doors and told them they were sealed in now. Ben said he remembered her crying in the laundry room, talking on the phone. But police records showed no phone service in the Martin home for over 3 weeks. The final thing Ben remembered was the sound of the bathtub running. It wasn't normal, he said. It didn't sound like water. It sounded like whispering. Dr. Stroud asked him what it said. Ben didn't answer. He just got up, walked to her office window, and began erasing the condensation with his finger. He drew the symbol again. "That's the door," he said. "It lets it in." And in that moment, Dr. Stroud stopped thinking this was just a boy with delusions, because she'd seen that symbol before. Not in a textbook, not in Ben's file, but in another, unrelated case she hadn't thought about in years. Next, we uncover what Dr. Stroud remembered and how another case may be connected. Dr. Helen Stroud wasn't prone to superstition. She'd trained at Cambridge, worked in war zones, and studied psychosis under some of the most brilliant minds in Europe. Her job was to make sense of fractured minds, not entertain ghost stories. But when Ben Martin drew that symbol, something shifted. A cold clarity settled in her chest. She'd seen it before, exactly once, and it had haunted her for nearly 20 years. In 1987, she was a junior research intern at a psychiatric institution in rural Texas. It wasn't a place people remembered fondly. The building itself had been converted from an old sanatorium, and most of its patients were long-term residents, men and women who'd been institutionalized before modern reform laws. One of them was a woman named Dorothy Lanes. Dorothy had been committed at the age of 18 after allegedly drowning her infant son in a motel bathtub. But what made her case stand out wasn't just the crime. It was her behavior after. She never showed remorse. She never screamed. She just hummed the same 4-note melody over and over, no matter the time of day. Stroud had been assigned to log Dorothy's daily observations. At first, it felt routine. Then on the 4th day, she noticed something on the wall beside the bed. A symbol scratched into the paint, hidden behind a loose tile, the same as the one Ben drew. Stroud had asked the head psychiatrist about it. He told her it was nonsense, said some patients fixated on meaningless marks. But a week later, Dorothy was found dead in her room. No suicide note, no signs of struggle. She'd drowned in a locked room with no water source. The staff dismissed it as an embolism, but Stroud always wondered, why did her lungs fill with fluid if she hadn't inhaled anything? Now nearly 2 decades later, Ben Martin had drawn the exact same symbol. And when asked where he saw it, he didn't hesitate. Behind the bathtub, it was already there. Ben never knew Dorothy. He wasn't even born when she died. But the connection, the deaths, the water, the humming all pointed towards something older. Something no longer confined to just psychiatric records or whispered suspicions. Stroud retrieved her personal notes from that 1987 case. She still had them in a shoebox. Page after page of Dorothy's statements. Most were incoherent, but one line stood out, written over and over. The door opens where water lingers. It only needs one listener. She circled that phrase. What if Jonathan Martin had become that listener? What if this wasn't just psychosis? What if he didn't imagine something in the drains, but invited it in? Stroud submitted a confidential memorandum to the Oklahoma City Behavioral Unit linking the 2 cases. It was buried in less than 72 hours. The response came back in official terms. No verifiable overlap. Recommend no further correspondence on this case. But someone must have read it, because that same week, her office was broken into. Nothing was taken except her 1987 notes. If Dr. Helen Stroud hadn't gone back to the burned Martin home, none of what followed would have surfaced. She wasn't authorized. In fact, she was under direct instruction not to return, especially not alone. The house was condemned, set to be demolished after the arson investigation closed. But something about Ben's drawing, the symbol, wouldn't let her go. She needed to see for herself. It was nearly dusk when she arrived. The two-story suburban house stood like a hollowed-out shell, blackened and buckling inward. The fire hadn't taken everything, but what remained was worse. Walls half-melted, staircases warped, and inside, a lingering smell of burnt plastic and something sweeter, human. Stroud entered through the rear door. The kitchen was unrecognizable, but the hallway remained intact. She walked past the charred remnants of picture frames and into the bathroom where Ben claimed to have seen the symbol. The tub was gone, the floor collapsed. But behind the hole in the tiles, something gleamed. Stroud reached in and pulled out a brass ring, not a finger ring, but a structural handle bolted into what looked like a trapdoor. It wasn't part of the house's original blueprint. She pried it open. Below was a narrow brick well, about 3 feet wide, descending into pitch-black darkness. The smell that hit her was not of fire. It was something ancient, damp, metallic, like rainwater and rusted bone. Using her phone light, she peered down. On the bricks, every few feet, was that same carved symbol. Dozens of them identical. She couldn't explain it, but in that moment, she felt it. The air around her grew heavier. Her chest tightened. Somewhere deep in the well, she heard it, a faint humming. 4 notes, just like Dorothy Lane's, just like Ben. She backed away and closed the trap. Back in her car, still shaking, she began researching historical symbols tied to that shape. She filtered out the usual occult nonsense, instead focusing on local history, municipal records, settler notes, and 19th century state archives. Then she found it. In 1904, just outside Oklahoma City, a settlement church burned to the ground under uncertain circumstances. No bodies were ever found, but several stone baptismal wells were discovered beneath the ruins. The parish had been excommunicated in 1897 due to a ritualistic deviation from Methodist norms. Among the confiscated relics was a book of hymns, all consisting of 4-note melodies. On the last page of the book, a hand-drawn symbol. Identical. Helen Stroud stared at the scan, heart racing. This wasn't mental illness. This was inheritance. Whatever had reached Jonathan Martin had reached others before him. And now it was speaking to his son. Next, we return to Ben and learn what he saw the night his father changed. Ben hadn't spoken in weeks. Not since the fire, not since he watched his father slit open his mother's throat in the kitchen while humming a melody no one recognized. But he wasn't mute, not exactly. He still whispered, just not to people. Dr. Stroud returned to the children's ward to check on him the morning after discovering the hidden well. She noticed something new. A metal drain in the corner of the tiled floor, the kind you find in old medical buildings for sanitation. Ben was sitting beside it, knees drawn up, his lips barely moving. She stepped closer. "Ben, what are you saying?" He didn't flinch, didn't blink. Just kept whispering softly, directly into the drain. 4 notes, again and again, like a chant. That same melody. She leaned in closer. That's when he stopped and finally looked at her. And said, "He's still singing, but not from here. From under." "Under where, Ben?" Ben didn't answer. He slowly turned the drain's metal lid with his fingers, not strong enough to lift it, and pointed to the small gap between the grating and the tiles. There, just for a moment, she heard it. A tap, then another. Then something that sounded like muffled humming. From beneath the hospital. Stroud didn't sleep that night. She pulled every architectural record she could get her hands on for the state-run facility where Ben was being housed. What she found startled her. The building had originally been a state tuberculosis sanatorium, built in 1921. Below the ground level was a network of tunnels and drainage systems, including disused wells, storm cellars, and sealed hydrotherapy rooms that hadn't been touched in nearly 70 years. And buried in one of the planning sketches, barely visible, was something else. A circle beneath the west wing, marked only with the words, "Ritual Pit, sealed 1949. She printed the sheet and stared at it in disbelief. No one ever mentioned that in her medical schooling. No one at the hospital talked about it. And yet, it had been there the whole time. She returned the next morning to check the drain again. This time, the grating had been removed. Ben was nowhere to be found. She sounded the alarm. Staff searched the hallways, bathrooms, and secure therapy rooms. Nothing, until a nurse found the access door to the basement ajar. They followed the old maintenance route, long closed off, through rusted stairwells and decaying corridors lit only by emergency bulbs. At the end of one tunnel was a metal utility hatch recently opened. Below it, stairs into darkness. Ben was sitting on the bottom step, calm, silent, and barefoot. When they reached him, he looked up and said something that stopped everyone cold. He stopped singing when I got close because he smelled Mom. Ben didn't resist when they lifted him up the stairs, but he wouldn't speak either. He just kept glancing behind them, toward the pit at the bottom of the stairwell, toward the dark. They took him back to his room and sedated him, but Dr. Stroud stayed behind. She needed to know what was down there. She returned to the stairwell, armed with only a flashlight and a crowbar. The air was colder, damp, and smelled like mildew and something else she couldn't place like old teeth. The stairwell ended in a concrete chamber. The walls were covered in black mold. The floor was rotted wood, but in the center, a large square panel had been sawed clean out. It looked recent. There were fresh scrape marks, and just beyond that hole was a narrow ring of brick leading straight down. This was it, the ritual pit. And someone had been inside it. She aimed her torch downward. The shaft was about 15 feet deep. At the bottom, water, or at least some dark liquid. Floating in it, dozens of papers, photographs, bones, symbols scratched into the walls, visible even through the grime. But it wasn't just objects. There was something else in the water, something bigger. She squinted. It was a figure, hunched, face up, pale. She stumbled back. It was Jonathan Martin's body. Or something that looked like him, but it wasn't decomposed. His skin was pale but smooth, not bloated, not torn. Eyes shut as if asleep, a peaceful expression. Except the corner of his mouth was pulled up just slightly in a smile, like he'd just heard something funny. Stroud fled up the stairs and reported everything. Police were called. Hazmat teams followed. The recovery took hours. And when the body was pulled up, something else became clear. The throat had not been slit. There was no blood, no signs of trauma. The man was perfectly intact. So whose body had they found in the kitchen that night? And who had they cremated? Ben was awake again that evening, drawing silently in his notebook. Dr. Stroud sat beside him. He pushed the notebook toward her, a drawing of the pit. And beside it, not just his father's body, but a second man. Not a drawing of a dead body. A man standing in the pit, watching, smiling. Stroud asked, "Who was that, Ben?" He looked down and whispered, "He was always under there. Dad just helped him out for a while." She stared at the picture again. The face of the second man wasn't quite human, too long, too wide. And where the mouth should have ended, it didn't. Next, we returned to the house where it all began. But nothing is where it should be. The recovery team expected rot, dust, blood spatter, something to make sense of the carnage. But when they re-entered the Martin home to begin a full forensic sweep, they found almost nothing. The living room, where the first victim was killed, had already been cleaned. No stains on the carpet. No drag marks. No signs of a struggle. Just a white armchair positioned too perfectly in the center of the room, facing the fireplace. Even stranger, the walls, not just clean, scrubbed. So much so that layers of paint had been stripped back to the plaster in places. One investigator pressed his finger against a faint line beneath a windowsill and noticed something. The white on the wall wasn't paint. It was lime wash, used historically to mask odors and blood. Who had cleaned this? The mother before she died, or had Jonathan been preparing? In the bathroom, they found a set of surgical tools, old but polished, arranged in a neat row on a white towel. A pair of forceps still had hair stuck to the hinge. None of it matched any of the family. The DNA tests took weeks, but when they came back, they shocked everyone. The hair belonged to a missing girl from 3 years earlier, a child who'd vanished 2 streets over. No one had ever connected her case to the Martins, until now. The town had long whispered that Jonathan Martin had once studied mortuary science, briefly before becoming a baker. Now it seemed he hadn't forgotten a thing. The cellar was worse. Beneath the floorboards, tucked into a hollow between the studs, they found jars, sealed tight, each one filled with alcohol. Inside, body parts, small ones, preserved too well for how long they must have been there. A toe, a finger, a tongue. In one, a child's eye, still intact, floating like a pearl in a dark jar. Labeled, dated, no names, just numbers. Back in his room, Ben was drawing again. Dr. Stroud asked him gently, "Do you know who those belong to?" Ben nodded. "They were the bad ones. The bad ones Dad said they were unclean. God said so. He was saving the good ones." "What do you mean, saving them?" Ben looked up, his voice flat. "He said they'd be needed when the house wakes up again." Stroud froze. "Wakes up?" Ben pointed to the floor. "The walls go to sleep sometimes, but they'll open again soon." That night, one of the forensic techs, a woman named Carly, locked herself in the bathroom. She was found hours later, rocking and whispering, having scratched a single sentence into her arms using a shard of broken mirror. "He's not gone. He just got in." Deputy Harlan Rhodes had served in war zones, but nothing unnerved him like the smell under the Martin house. It wasn't rot, at least not fresh rot. It was older, more sour than putrid. A smell he couldn't quite place, like wet pennies and spoiled milk, metallic and sweet. He followed it into the cellar, past the broken freezer, past the loose floorboard where the jars had been hidden. Then he saw it. A trapdoor set beneath an old rug, almost too perfect, almost staged. He hesitated. Behind him, the forensic team began muttering, "You all smell that? Christ, it's in my clothes now." When they pried open the trapdoor, it revealed a set of crumbling wooden steps. Roots had pushed through the ceiling, curling like veins. The air got colder, wet. They descended in silence, each footfall echoing with a dull, soft thud. Below them, a single corridor carved into Oklahoma clay. No electricity, no ventilation, just dirt walls, hand-dug, lined with support beams. And carvings, all along the walls. Dozens, maybe hundreds of names, scratched in with something sharp fingernails, maybe, or old bones. Some were dates, some had initials, a few were just prayers. But one message repeated every few feet, always the same 6 words. He feeds the house feeds him. The end of the tunnel opened into a circular room, and there, half buried in the dirt floor, was a large stone. Black, obsidian volcanic glass, too smooth, too perfect, but it hummed. Not metaphorically audibly. Deputy Rhodes reached out, just a finger, touched the surface, and pulled back instantly. It wasn't cold or hot. It was alive. "Sir," one of the team called to him. They'd found something behind the stone, another jar. Inside, a lock of hair, a milk tooth, and a scrap of paper folded so many times it nearly dissolved when opened. On it, a hand-drawn symbol, rough, circular, almost like a sun. Except the center wasn't a sun. It was a mouth, teeth and all. Meanwhile, above ground, Ben had gone silent. Stopped drawing, stopped speaking. Dr. Stroud noticed something in the boy's posture. He'd begun to mimic someone, or something. He sat with his back straight, his eyes forward. He refused to look at the windows or the corners of the room. When asked why, he only whispered, "He sees through the dirt." Who? Dad said the house had an eye. That's how it finds who's next. Back in the tunnel, one of the junior deputies stood too close to the stone. She stepped forward just once and collapsed. Heart attack, seizure, no one could tell. But her lips were moving, and when they listened closely, she was speaking Latin. The town of Tallon Ridge had long forgotten its origins. Most believed it was founded in the late 1800s by cattlemen and churchgoers seeking quiet and faith. But Deputy Rhodes knew better now. The stone wasn't just some occult fetish or child's ghost story. It was part of something older and darker. When the black slab was unearthed beneath the Martin house, Rhodes ordered the local archives opened. Files untouched for decades, locked drawers with crumbling ledgers, newspaper clippings printed in faded ink on brittle paper. And beneath it all, a church register from 1894. The first few pages were standard: births, deaths, weddings. But then, something strange. Every so often, the word baptism was crossed out, replaced with the word offering. There were names beside it, children, ages 6 to 12, all marked with the same phrase, given to the foundation. Witnessed by 5. The ink was smeared, some pages were torn, but the name of the officiant remained clear: Reverend Silas Martin, Jonathan Martin's great-grandfather. The Martin family had been part of the town's bloodline from the beginning, but no one ever talked about them. They owned land, donated to the local church, even helped build the orphanage. Always quietly, always just enough to earn trust. But this wasn't religion. This was ritual. And it went far beyond the Martins. In a dusty old tin, Rhodes found a black and white photo dated 1902. A church congregation outside a long collapsed building. All dressed in black despite the summer date. No smiles. Every child with their hands bound in front of them. At the front, Reverend Silas Martin, one hand on a Bible, the other resting on what looked like a stone altar. The same stone now beneath the modern Martin home. The same black surface, the same impossible texture. It hadn't been moved. The house had been built around it. Back at the hospital, Ben was beginning to speak again, But his drawings had changed. Gone were the stick figures. Now he drew eyes. Dozens of them, inside floorboards, beneath beds, in the dirt below trees. "He doesn't sleep," Ben whispered to Dr. Stroud. "He just waits until the house gets hungry again." Stroud asked who he was. Ben answered with a name no one had taught him, Silas. Later that night, Dr. Stroud reviewed old patient files connected to the town. There had been others. Children who saw things, who heard voices in the ground, who disappeared after sleepwalking. But one report chilled her. A boy in 1974 had spoken a nearly identical phrase. "He watches through the dirt." And he too had drawn the same symbol, a circle with a mouthful of teeth. Just like Ben. Rhodesy sat alone in the archive room that evening, watching the black and white church photo again. He noticed something he hadn't before. In the far corner, the shadow of a fifth man. Not named, not facing the camera. But where his feet stood, the grass was dead. The discovery came not from an investigator, but from the house itself. One of the demolition crew, a young man named Dylan, had returned alone to the Martin property just after dawn. His partner was late, and the morning was quiet, too quiet. Inside the gutted remains of the kitchen wall, Dylan spotted something odd. A portion of drywall that felt wrong. Not newer, but older, hollow. He pried it open and found a box wrapped in thick, rotting fabric. Inside, a journal, bound not in leather, but what looked eerily like tanned animal skin. The pages were discolored, cracked at the corners, and the handwriting was meticulous, steady, clinical. He turned to the first page. There, written in perfect cursive, "If this book is open, the hunger has returned. It feeds through blood, but it sees through the fifth eye." Dylan didn't understand it, but something told him this was no ordinary diary. He brought it to Deputy Rhodes, who immediately took it to Dr. Stroud. Together, they opened it carefully, one page at a time. It was written by Reverend Silas Martin, and it chronicled over 4 decades of offerings. The language was coded, not overt but spiritual. He spoke of the circle beneath the stone, the voice in the floorboards, and the importance of innocence and silence. The journal described rituals held on every 5th moon, always involving 5 members. The others were unnamed, only listed as Brother A through Brother D. But the 5th was always called the Eye. Stroud began to piece it together. The 5th eye wasn't a person. It was a child, always a child. One who saw, one who remembered, one who survived. And for every set of offerings, one child was spared not out of mercy, but as witness, as vessel. Ben wasn't the first. He was the latest. Silas had designed a ritual to continue even after death. Something that could pass through bloodlines, through silence, through trauma. And worst of all, the ritual demanded that the 5th eye return to the house to complete the circle. Stroud looked again at Ben's newest drawing. This one was different. It was a map. Not of the house, but beneath it. Crawl spaces, secret rooms, trapdoors. And at the center, a black shape circled in red. Next to it, the words, "It's not sleeping." She asked Ben who told him about the map. He didn't speak. He only looked toward the wall and smiled. Next, we uncover what lies beneath the foundation and why the Martins were never allowed to move away. The floor of the Martin home had always creaked in strange places, even when it was newly built. Locals once blamed it on bad construction or Oklahoma's shifting ground, but after the journal was discovered, the attention turned downward. Ben's map showed something the blueprints never had: a trapdoor under the hallway rug. Deputy Rhodes and Dr. Stroud, along with 2 state officials, returned to the home. The rug was long gone, but the wooden panel beneath it was unmistakable. Unlike the rest of the floor, this panel had nails that had been burned black. When pried open, they released a smell like wet coins and dead air. They descended with gloves, flashlights, and a GoPro. The crawl space was dry, silent, untouched by time. But 10 feet in, the floor gave way to something deeper, a hollowed-out pit, man-made. There were markings on the walls, symbols carved into stone, similar to those in Ben's drawings. And at the center, laid in a circle of dried blood and ash, 4 decayed bodies. They weren't recent. Stroud guessed they'd been buried at least 30 to 40 years ago, far earlier than the recent murders. And they had all been positioned the same way. Arms crossed, eyes gouged, mouths stitched shut. Near them, scraps of old cloth, remnants of robes or ceremonial garments, had been preserved in the still, dry earth. Alongside them, a wooden bowl, cracked in half, with what looked like teeth embedded in its rim. One more thing, there were spaces for 5. 1 body was missing. The implications were horrifying. The Martins didn't start the ritual, they inherited it. Each generation passing it forward, cleansing, sacrificing, hiding. Silas had simply refined it, making it cleaner, more spiritual, easier to conceal. He didn't invent the evil, he was raised by it. Then came the deeper question: who was the missing body? Who had been part of the original circle and escaped burial? Was it Silas? Or worse, someone still alive? Someone who made sure the 5th body remained available for the next cycle? As they emerged from the pit, Rhodes spotted something else wedged into the dirt near the 5th grave. A child's shoe, clean, preserved, as if it had never decayed. Inside it, folded neatly, was a slip of paper. It read, "He watches through their eyes. He waits until they forget." Ben had drawn that symbol too. Only he didn't call it a symbol. He called it the mouth in the ground. The question haunted every investigator, every forensic tech, and every reader of Ben's journal. Who was the missing 5th body? To find out, Deputy Rhodes turned to the oldest surviving records of the land itself. Before the house was built in 1962 by Paul and Ruth Martin, before the farmhouse, before the clearing, the land had belonged to an unincorporated religious commune, active from 1948 to 1955. There were no tax filings, no death certificates, and no clear leadership. They were known by locals only as the Circle of Providence. Most people assumed they were missionaries or a prayer group, but a surviving land deed named 5 trustees, all male, all unrelated by blood, but all with Scots-Irish surnames. One of them, Gideon Martin, Silas's grandfather. An archived fire report from 1955 revealed that their original chapel, a crude wooden structure near the creek, burned to the ground in late summer. The cause was unclear, but the report notes a chilling line scrolled in chalk across the ruined threshold. One broke the seal, the rest must feed. Soon after the fire, 4 of the 5 men disappeared. No records, no burials, only Gideon remained. And 2 months later, he bought the land again, in his own name this time, and began construction on what would become the Martin home. The exact center of the home sat atop the burned chapel site. Ben's journal contained pages that looked out of place, written in a much older hand. They were brittle, inked in faded brown, with phrases like, "The mouth below is never sated. Only the 5th shall walk above. He watches through their eyes, waits until the vessel is ready." The writing matched samples of Gideon's from state records. He had kept the pages, probably passed down after the fire, and Silas had given them to Ben without explanation. What this meant was undeniable. The Martin murders were not a sudden tragedy. They were the continuation of an old pact, passed down from men who believed in feeding something beneath the land, something they called providence. Only one had tried to walk away. He never reappeared. And every generation since, someone always died. Someone was always spared. But why Ben? Why was he the one they left behind? Back in the basement, Rhodes laid out the evidence. 4 bodies in the pit, a 5th space left open, a child's shoe preserved, and the land's history pointing toward a ritualistic cycle. Ben's survival wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Someone had chosen him, just like someone had chosen Silas once, years ago. The horror wasn't just in what they did. It was in how long they'd been doing it. It was summer 1979. Silas Martin had just turned 19. By then, he was already a hardened young man, sharp-eyed, strong-willed, and cold in a way no child should have been. But he was also curious, and that curiosity, Ruth used to say, would be the ruin of him. He began to dig, not because he suspected anything, but because the basement had begun to smell. Not like mold. Something sharper, metallic, like old coins and rot. It started after a thunderstorm. Silas had been in the root cellar taking inventory for his father when he heard something behind the wall. A scraping, then a knock, then silence. At first, he thought it was a rat, maybe a raccoon, but then it spoke. I told them not to finish it. They didn't listen. You still can. Silas pried open the wall. Behind the loose bricks was an earthen tunnel, not tall enough to stand in, but long enough to disappear into shadow. He crawled. For 30 feet, he moved through mud, stones, and a smell that grew thicker the deeper he went. And then suddenly, a chamber carved by hand, reinforced with wooden beams older than the house. And there, lying in the dirt, was a man. His hair had thinned to wisps, his teeth were brown and shattered, but his eyes, they were Gideon's eyes. It was Caleb, one of the original 5, the one who had run. He hadn't escaped. He had been buried, or perhaps buried himself, in the soil beneath the chapel ruins. Silas didn't run. He sat with the man for hours. He listened. Caleb told him everything about the pact, the thing beneath the ground, the price for protection. We thought it would keep us safe. It did for a while, but we never stopped paying. One by one, it took us until I was the only one left. And now you've built a house on its back. Silas asked him why he stayed. Why not just run? Caleb smiled, or tried to. What was left of his lips cracked like paper. Because it speaks. Because I hear it in my sleep. And if I leave, it follows. He held something out to Silas. A box wrapped in leather, stitched shut with twine made of hair. Silas took it. When you know what's inside, you'll understand why you must never have a son. Years later, that same box would be found among Silas's possessions. Deputy Rhodes didn't open it at first, but he would. And when he did, the story would shift again, because what was inside shouldn't exist. Not in 1986, not in 1955, not anywhere. That night in 1979, Silas sealed the tunnel behind him. He told no one, not even Ruth, but he began preparing. He knew now what the house had been built on. He knew why his family kept surviving while others vanished. And he knew that one day, he'd have to offer something back. Silas didn't open the box for 5 years. He kept it buried beneath the floorboards of his room. hidden in a shoebox beneath folded towels, and a Gideon family Bible that hadn't been touched since the late 60s. Ruth once asked him what he was hiding. He said, "A part of someone." She never asked again. But in 1984, 2 years before the police ever came near the Martin house, something changed. A child from the next county, 7-year-old Jacob Dietz, disappeared on his way to school. The 4th child in 2 years. No bodies, no suspects, no ransom notes. Just a trail of old stories. Whispers from folks on the edge of town who spoke of a shadow with hands, children led by music, and a name that had begun to circulate again: Martin Hollow. Silas had grown into a man by then, still living on the farm, still quiet, still watching. But now, he opened the box. Inside were strands of hair, human, brittle, and each bound with parchment tags, aged and yellow. Each tag bore a name, a date, and what looked like a small carved symbol. Not English, not anything readable. There were 14 bundles. Silas read the names. He knew 7 of them. They weren't from Martin Hollow. They were from Wilkes County, Greene, Ashe, the same counties where those missing children were being reported now. He took the box to the Wilkes County Records office. He didn't speak, just placed it on the desk of the receptionist and left. That same week, Deputy Sheriff Sarah Manning, then new to the force, was handed the file. What she read in those tags would eventually lead her to reopen the Martin family history. But she didn't believe in folklore. She believed in patterns. And these names, they weren't just victims. They were all tied to families who had once lived in or near the original Gideon tract land that was supposed to have been sold off after the church burned in 1921. But a pattern began to form. Every 11 years, a cluster of disappearances, always children. Always near the soil where the original 5 made their pact. And something, was collecting pieces of them. Hair, teeth, nails, all buried in these boxes. 4 of them were later recovered. 1 from a well, 1 from the back of an abandoned church, 1 nailed inside a schoolhouse wall. But Silas's was the first. And it contained something else no other box had, a map. Drawn in what appeared to be ash, it traced the subterranean pathways under the Martin house, stretching to forgotten Gideon burial grounds. That was when Sarah realized this wasn't just a crime. It was a system, old, maintained, fed. She wrote in her notes, "This isn't a cult. It's a ritual inheritance." These people didn't believe in demons. They believed in feeding the land. And now the land wants more. Silas never spoke again after that day. But a year later, in 1985, he left something behind. A journal filled with drawings of the tunnels, of the man beneath the soil, and of what was coming next. Next, we uncover the journal, and inside are pages that describe the red sound, a sound only the children could hear before they vanished. Deputy Sarah Manning read the journal alone in her patrol car. It was the kind of reading that stains you. Not because it was violent, though it was, but because it was written like a prayer. Silas Martin's handwriting was calm, steady, like someone trying to bottle a storm by pretending it didn't exist. Page after page, drawings of tunnels beneath the farmhouse, maps of doors that no longer stood, crude illustrations of stick-figure children with hollow faces, walking hand in hand towards something buried. But what chilled her the most wasn't what he drew. It was what he described in just 3 words, the red sound. Silas first heard it at age 6. He said it came from beneath the roots of the cornfield just after the first frost. It was always low, like a vibration you couldn't locate, but felt in your teeth. Not music, not a voice, something in between. A summoning, he wrote, only children can hear it at first. It's how it chooses. Those who follow never come back the same. The red sound is not from the earth. It's from what sleeps beneath it. Silas claimed his older brother, Elijah, heard it first in 1969. 2 weeks later, he disappeared. The family claimed he ran away. But Silas said he saw it. Elijah walking barefoot through the night, mouth moving like he was whispering to someone inside the wind. 3 days later, their father came home with blood on his overalls and told everyone Elijah had gone north for the Lord. No questions were asked. No one ever saw Elijah again. But in Silas's journal, he drew what he saw in the barn that night. A boy kneeling in dirt, head tilted, and shadows around him. Too many legs, none of them human. Sarah Manning knew it was madness on the surface. But paired with the box of hair, the missing children, the forgotten church records, something fit too closely to ignore. Silas ended one entry with a single sentence. If you're reading this, they know you're close. Sarah put down the journal and checked her rearview mirror. A white truck had been following her since she left the evidence station. No headlights, no plates, just waiting. She made a decision that night. She wouldn't submit the journal into evidence. Not yet. She needed someone else to see it first. A woman who had once tried to shut down the Martin case in 1978. A retired social worker named Hattie Downs, the same woman who left the state after a baby's blood was found smeared across her office door in 1980. Sarah was about to find out why. Retired social worker Hattie Downs hadn't given a formal statement since 1980. After 3 of her foster cases vanished without a trace, all connected to one place, Martin Hollow, she packed her bags, quit her position, and moved 600 miles away. But what no one knew was that she'd left something behind. A locked filing cabinet, and inside it, sealed notes, illegally copied records, and a baby's photograph, scorched at the edges. Sarah Manning tracked her down through an old caseworker registry. When she arrived at Hattie's trailer, the woman looked like she'd been waiting for this moment for decades. I told them, she whispered, but they buried the babies and the truth with them. Hattie handed Sarah a folder marked Children Grown. Inside were images never filed into any public case. A baby boy with pupils like pinpricks, found alone in the woods near the Martin property. An anonymous note, he is clean, do not return. A medical report describing strange marks under the child's tongue. 3 puncture-like impressions in a triangle. But the most disturbing file was handwritten. Hattie had gone undercover in 1977, posing as a foster applicant at the county office. One of the Martin girls, just 13, had shown up pregnant, barefoot, and unable to speak. She'd drawn symbols on Hattie's notepad, circles inside circles, and the same 3 punctures appeared on her wrists. Hattie described the compound with chilling detail. They don't use names after age 10, just roles. Reapers, watchers, mothers. Each child is assigned a burial song to hum before bed. The crops weren't just corn. They hid something beneath them. Something that feeds. She'd tried to file for protective custody 3 times. Each time, the case was dropped. No explanation, no appeal. One judge simply told her, these people don't break the law. They wrote the one they follow. Sarah scanned every page. She couldn't believe how long this had been going on and how many had looked away. The photo of the burned baby still sat on the table, and behind it, tucked inside a medical envelope, was a single piece of hair, white blonde like bleached corn silk. The label, Specimen 3A Martin Hollow infant, unaged. Sarah's hands shook. This wasn't just murder. This was breeding, harvesting, and hiding. She looked at Hattie. "Why are you helping now?" The woman didn't blink. "Because I still hear it sometimes, that red sound. And last week, it came from my basement." Dr. William Krantz had been the county's chief coroner for over 30 years. He'd seen overdose cases, drownings, even the aftermath of ritual killings during the late 60s. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for the Martin autopsies. He wasn't the first to examine the bodies, but he was the first to say no. No to the forced sign-off. No to the cause of death being listed as exposure. No to the hush money. And that's when he knew he wouldn't be around much longer. One of the Martin children, a girl roughly age 9, had been found curled beneath a collapsed section of barn. No blood, no visible trauma. But when Krantz opened her chest cavity, what he found wasn't a child's heart. Instead, a pulsing, fibrous mass, gray-white and veined, smooth, with no chambers, no valves, covered in something like corn husk threads. And it gave off a faint vibration, even after refrigeration. He immediately contacted state forensic labs. They told him to dispose of it. Instead, he froze it and locked it in a lead-lined sample safe in his home lab. 2 days later, someone broke into his office. Not the safe, not the cabinets, just the files. Specifically, every autopsy connected to the Martins, but they missed something. Inside an old dentistry case file, Krantz had hidden 35mm film negatives, photos of the mass, and one X-ray. What the X-ray showed still haunts Sarah Manning to this day. The girl's skeletal structure was subtly shifted, as if she'd grown up too fast. Her spine had an extra vertebra, her ribs weren't symmetrical, and her teeth. They looked like they'd never fallen out. Like infant teeth, hardened into permanence. Sarah asked Dr. Krantz if any of this could be explained medically. He shook his head slowly. No disease explains this, and no child survives that long with whatever that was keeping them alive. He poured them both a glass of bourbon and added quietly, "I called a friend at the university, sent him a tissue sample. A week later, he mailed it back. No note, just a sticky label on the bag. Not plant, not animal. Dispose immediately." Sarah asked the question she dreaded. "Do you think they were altered?" Dr. Krantz didn't hesitate. "I think they were grown for something, but I don't think it worked, not the way they wanted." And then, with a resigned sigh, he handed Sarah a single VHS tape. No label, only the date. March 23, 1979, the night before the Martins disappeared. He looked at her, face pale. They filmed what they were doing. I've never watched it. But maybe it's time someone did. Sarah waited until she got home. Locked the doors, pulled the shades, poured a drink. Then, with trembling hands, she loaded the old VHS into her father's dusty player. The screen flickered. Static, then a low hum, and then a basement. It wasn't the Martin basement. This one had tiled walls, fluorescent lighting, and a camera fixed in place. Time code in the corner, read 032379 p.m. 3 children stood in the center of the frame. Barefoot, hair-shaved, wearing white smocks. Their mouths moved, but no sound came through. Just the hum, low rhythmic, as if recorded over something else. Then came a 4th child, older, wearing a black mask. He moved to each child in turn and touched their chest with what looked like a copper rod. Each time, the child jerked violently, like being shocked, but no one screamed, no one even blinked. Next, a woman stepped into frame. She wore a nurse's uniform, but her namatag was scratched out with marker. She wheeled in a gurney. Laid across it was a body, female, maybe in her 30s. Eyes open, not blinking, not breathing. The masked child leaned down and whispered something in the body's ear. Then the woman on the table opened her mouth and began to hum. The same tone as the static. Sarah paused the tape. She wanted to stop, but she couldn't. She pressed play again. The final 10 minutes showed a map. Hand-drawn, old, burnt at the edges. It wasn't of the town, not exactly. It was of what lay beneath the town. A vast series of chambers labeled only with initials. R.H.W. 13 child rows, rootstock, and one final word written in red ink. Graft line. Then the screen went black. Sarah stared at her reflection in the screen. Behind her, the room was silent. But she could still hear that hum. Not from the tape, from her walls. From the pipes, from underneath the floorboards. She packed the tape into a padded envelope and labeled it, "To be released if I go missing." Then she called Deputy Ryan, the only person she trusted, and said, "There's something under the town, and I think they're trying to grow it back." Next, we descend into the tunnels beneath the Martin property and uncover what's still growing. 2 days later, Sarah returned to the Martin property, alone. No backup, no cameras, just a flashlight, gloves, and that same sick feeling that had been growing since she watched the tape. She didn't tell dispatch, didn't tell the sheriff, because if what she found down there was real, they'd bury her too. The basement had been sealed off by then. Yellow tape across the door, a warning nailed into the frame. "Do not enter, biohazard." But Sarah pried it open anyway. The wooden stairs moaned under her weight as she stepped down. The air was different now. Not just damp, it was warm, breathing. At the far wall, behind an old freezer, was a hatch, just like the map. Heavy, iron-rimmed, welded shut long ago, but rust had weakened it. Sarah wedged her crowbar into the seam and heaved. With a screech like an animal in pain, the hatch popped open. And what she saw beneath ... a shaft. Narrow, old, stone-lined, with rebar handholds leading into the dark. She climbed. 10 feet, then 20. The air grew hotter, thicker. At the bottom, a dirt tunnel stretched out in both directions, supported by timber beams slick with condensation. She pulled out her phone, used the flashlight. There were symbols etched into the beams, runes, numbers, words in Latin, and one repeated word, graft line. Further down the passage, the walls changed from stone to organic. Roots had overtaken everything, thick, vein-like strands pulsing slightly, as if alive. And in the center of the chamber, a mound, covered in cloth, child-sized. She approached slowly, her breath caught. The cloth was old, hand-stitched. A name embroidered in red thread, Abigail Martin. But Abigail was buried in the town cemetery, or was she? Sarah pulled the cloth back. The body beneath was small, preserved, but not like a normal corpse. Its skin was gray, waxy, and too perfect. The eyes were open, glassy, but not dead. And from the back of the skull, roots had grown out, burrowing into the ground like a tree. The girl wasn't decomposing. She was growing. Sarah stumbled back, horrified. But before she could run, she heard it. That same hum from the tape. Not a sound, more like a frequency vibrating in her teeth. She turned. At the far end of the tunnel, 3 more figures were emerging. Small, pale, rooted, all with eyes open. All watching her. She ran. Back in daylight, she threw up beside her cruiser. She wanted to call for help, but how do you report something like that? Yes, hi. I just found a garden of children growing beneath a murder house. She couldn't, not yet, but she knew the truth now. And someone had built that root chamber on purpose. Sarah didn't sleep that night, not after what she'd seen under that house. The word graft line haunted her. What kind of person plants a child? And more importantly, who planned it? She returned to the evidence board, not the physical one at the station. That was for show. She had a second one in her garage. And in the corner of that board, pinned for weeks and barely noticed, was an old name. Donald Eames, land surveyor. 1962 to 1983. Eames had worked for the state, mostly mapping mining shafts and water tables. But in the early 70s, he was hired privately to chart substructural anomalies beneath rural homes. One of those homes, the Martin property. Sarah found the record in a zoning permit archive, scribbled in pencil. Mapping request for lateral shaft beneath parcel number 107. Suspicious root mass noted. No follow-up requested. Signed, D. Eames. She found Eames barely alive, in a home for memory loss patients outside Baton Rouge. He was 92, didn't recognize her or anyone. But when she placed a copy of the map in his lap, his hand began to shake. Then he said one word. They paid me. It took hours of coaxing, but the old man slowly began to speak, fragments of memory surfacing. He said the tunnels were too perfect to be natural. The roots weren't from any tree he knew. They followed the old underground irrigation lines. He believed someone had been feeding the soil. When he reported it to parish officials, they told him to burn the notes. 3 days later, he was offered a buyout. Cash, no more questions. So he took it and disappeared. But Sarah pressed harder. Who built the tunnels, Doan? He looked up, tears in his eyes. Not built, guided. They said the ground already had it in it. We just helped it remember. She left his room in silence, mind racing. That meant someone knew the Martin land was different, chose it, and used it. Sarah returned to her car, flipped through the zoning reports, and cross-referenced every parcel Donald had surveyed with similar notes. A pattern emerged. 5 homes, each with odd child disappearances, each with a basement-level anomaly, each with a burned garden report filed decades earlier. The Martin home was just one branch of a much older root system. Back in town, Sarah visited the only living person who had once owned land adjacent to the Martin family, an old man named Clifford Bell. He opened the door before she knocked. "You finally found the tunnels," he said. Clifford Bell was 87, sharp-eyed, and already dressed like he'd been expecting Sarah. His front room smelled of linseed and tobacco. Old maps curled on shelves. He motioned for her to sit. "I wondered when someone would come asking," he said. "You're about 20 years too late." Clifford had inherited the property from his father, land adjacent to the Martin home, and he remembered everything about what lay beneath it. Not just the tunnels, but the rituals. He called them harvestings, said they'd happened every 19 years. Never the same house twice, but always the same signature. Children go missing. Animals turn on their young. The land turns quiet. Sarah asked the obvious. Who was behind it? He said it wasn't who, it was what. The soil, he said. Something in it hungers. He'd watched his own dog drag a child's shoe out of the roots one summer. He showed Sarah a newspaper from 1965, one she'd never seen. Boy vanishes near Bell property, only shoe found. But no follow-up article, no public search. The parish sealed it off. Why? Because Clifford made a deal. In 1972, A private company came to his door. Didn't give a name, but offered $30,000 in bonds to lease part of his land, on the condition he never questioned what they buried. He agreed. The next spring, the ground was leveled. No markers, no construction, just a new fence. And for 20 years, it stayed quiet. Until the Martins moved in, Sarah stared at Clifford. "You knew children were being taken?" "I knew worse," he whispered. "I knew where they ended up." He led her to his cellar. Beneath the floorboards was a trapdoor. Rusty, sealed. He hadn't opened it in decades, but now he insisted. What she saw below wasn't a tunnel, it was a burial site. Stone-lined, circular, almost ceremonial. And at the center, a wooden mask nailed to the floor, cracked, with human teeth embedded in the grain. Sarah's hands shook as she took photos. The deeper she looked, the more she saw what seemed like child-sized indentations in the dirt, as if something had grown out of them, not into them. She turned to Clifford, who stood pale. "I never touched it," he said. "But someone did. More than once." Before she left, Clifford handed her a small box. Inside was a journal belonging to someone named Sister Evelyn Martin. The name froze her blood. The journal was dated before the Martin family was even listed as homeowners. Next, we opened Sister Evelyn's journal, and what she wrote inside redefines everything Sarah thought she knew about the Martins. The leather cover was cracked, pages curled with age, but the ink was sharp, as if written yesterday. On the first page, "These are the things I must confess. Not to God, but to whoever survives us." EM 1959. Deputy Sarah Manning turned the pages slowly. The journal was part confession, part instruction manual. It began years before the Martin family ever officially moved into the house, before they even had children, and it wasn't addressed to a priest. It was addressed to the land. Evelyn Martin was not a nun by any church's standards, but she called herself one. She wrote about vows, a cleansing pact, a root inheritance. In one passage, she described how her mother gave birth underground during a solar eclipse, a birth attended only by women, and something she called the still man. Sarah reread that part twice. The still man appeared frequently in the pages, always written in uppercase, sometimes followed by, "Do not speak his name." He was described as faceless, a presence that watched their family from mirrors, from water, from dreams. She wrote, "We were the last line of the watchers. We kept him tethered, but we broke the rhythm. We buried the wrong twin." Sarah stopped cold. Wrong twin. The entries changed after that. Evelyn's tone shifted from faithful to frantic. She wrote of visions. She described how the ground began to whisper again. "The pit fills faster when we resist. One child every 5 years, or the roots take 3. It is mercy." Sarah felt sick. She skipped to the final pages, dated 1981. The handwriting was shaky, smudged with what looked like blood. "I can't hold the youngest back anymore. She hears him too clearly. Last night she spoke in his voice. If you find this, it means she opened the root. May God forgive us or destroy us." No name, no clear ending. But one detail stuck, scrawled in the margins beside the final page. A symbol Sarah had seen once before, 3 interlocking circles. And just below it, "Ask Henry where the real basement is." Henry Martin, the only known survivor. The boy Sarah once believed too traumatized to speak. Now she wondered, what if Henry wasn't mute because of trauma? What if he was waiting? Sarah returned to the Martin property just before dusk. She didn't call for backup, didn't sign out a radio. She didn't want interference, not this time. The sun sank behind the trees, bleeding red across the horizon. She stood at the threshold of the old house, heart pounding, Evelyn's journal in her coat pocket. There was no basement on file, according to county records. No blueprint, no mention. But Evelyn's last note was clear. Ask Henry where the real basement is. Henry Martin had been 6 when the murders happened. Found curled in the crawl space, silent, covered in blood that wasn't his. He hadn't spoken a full sentence in 42 years. Not to therapists, not to police, but Sarah remembered something. When she first met him, he kept drawing circles. 3 of them, interlocked. She found his old sketch in her case file last week. The same symbol Evelyn had drawn. Inside the Martin house, rot had deepened. Paint peeled in sheets. The air was damp with mold and memory. She found the cellar hatch where she'd seen Henry once crawl toward. But this time she looked closer. Behind a row of loose shelves, hidden by drywall once patched with care, she found it. A seam in the wood. No doorknob, only a carved circle, the symbol again. She pressed her palm against it. Click. The door opened without a sound. Steps descended into complete blackness. Not a basement. A chamber, cooler than the rest of the house. Stone walls, slick with moisture, and etched into them, dozens of names. Not just Martins. Dozens of family names, generations. But some had been scratched out violently. Others were freshly carved. She found hers. Manning, her breath caught in her throat. She backed away, but something creaked behind her. A second door, ajar. Beyond it, a small room. No furniture, just straw on the floor, and a child's toy horse resting in the center. She crouched. On the wall above the straw, written in red, "He's awake again." Suddenly, a voice behind her. High, fragile, male. "You shouldn't be down here." She turned. Henry Martin. Older now. Grayer. Gaunt. But his eyes, they were not the eyes of a broken man. They were aware. And worse, waiting. He didn't look at her, just past her toward the wall. "Did she write about me?" he asked. Sarah nodded. Henry exhaled. "I was the one they weren't supposed to keep." She stepped toward him. "What's down here, Henry?" He smiled, almost kindly. "Not what? Who?" And then he raised his hand and pointed to the wall again. There, just beside the words, "He's awake again," was something newly scratched in. "Welcome back, Sarah." Henry didn't move. Neither did Sarah. The silence between them was suffocating, but not empty. It was watching them. Sarah's flashlight flickered. She tapped it. Still dim. She took a step backward toward the chamber door, but Henry spoke again. "You ever wonder why Evelyn left you the journal?" Sarah stopped. "You thought it was random," he continued. "You thought she picked you because you were good, honest, different from the others." His head tilted. "She picked you because you're from here." Sarah felt a cold crawl up her spine. She was born in Missouri, but adopted. She'd never known who her biological family was. "You're a Martin," Henry said quietly. "No," Sarah whispered. "You were part of the experiment, but your mother ran before they could finish. Evelyn found you after. She raised you without telling anyone where you came from. She tried to break the cycle." Henry pointed again to the wall. "Your name carved, there wasn't a message. It was a warning." In the far corner of the chamber, the wall began to pulse, almost like it was breathing. Sarah turned slowly, flashlight trembling in her grip. The surface shifted, revealing not stone, but something organic beneath. Veins, faint movement. Something was inside the wall. Ezekiel wasn't a man, Henry murmured. He was a seed, a prototype. That thing behind the wall, that's the rootstock, the first. Sarah stared. You've seen it, she realized. You remember it. Henry nodded, eyes glinting in the darkness. I was 5 when they put me in front of it. It showed me things. It showed all of us things. He took a slow breath. And now it wants you. The wall cracked. A black, oily substance began seeping from between the stones. The chamber trembled. Far off, a deep groan echoed, like something ancient shifting underground. Sarah raised her gun. Henry didn't flinch. You can't kill it, he said. But you can bury it again. You just need a sacrifice. His eyes met hers. That's why Evelyn brought you back. That's why you were always meant to return. Sarah's radio, long dead, suddenly hissed. Through the static, a whisper. Do not let it out. It was Evelyn's voice. Sarah turned. The flashlight burned out completely. She had one option. She lunged for Henry, slamming him against the wall. He didn't fight. It's okay, he whispered. I'm ready. Behind them, the chamber lit up with a dull red glow, like fire inside flesh. She pulled the trigger. Henry collapsed. The wall behind him screamed. Then, silence. Outside, the earth rumbled. The Martin house collapsed inward as if swallowed. Sarah crawled out just in time, bruised and shaking. From the tree line, she looked back once. Where the house once stood, now only dirt. But in the air, faint and drifting like smoke, a lullaby. The one Evelyn had sung. The one Sarah remembered from her dreams as a child. That night, she didn't file a report. She didn't call it in. She drove straight to her mother's grave. There, she placed the journal on the soil and said only one word: thanks. She never spoke of what happened again. But if you go to the Martin property now, you'll see nothing, just a clearing. No foundation, no remains. But sometimes, if you stand in the right place, you'll feel warmth beneath your feet, like something is breathing under the ground.